Because, Jenny, it's not always our job to teach people a lesson. I have learned that maybe sometimes it's the Lord trying to teach us a lesson in possibly being more flexible. We're always demanding that it's our way without exception. We may never allow the Lord to soften our heart and teach us a better way of doing things that we might find, Lord, you knew best. And when I relinquished my preferences, my desires, then I found a better way to do it. Or I was able to win over that parent.
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
Welcome back. We are so glad you're joining us. Sarah Barker is back with us, and we are talking about the importance of parent-teacher relationships. In part one, we talked about communication, we talked about the importance of focusing on the individual student, and so many other topics. So if you missed out on part one, please be sure to go back and listen to that. Now, we're going to jump back in. Sarah, you mentioned the importance of flexibility as a teacher. I'll admit, sometimes that can be a hard one. So I want to revisit that because you mentioned it there in part one. Could you unpack that just a little bit more for us?
Yes, sure. I would definitely describe myself as a type A teacher. I like everything squarely in the middle of the box, and that we're all doing the same thing. We look very uniform. But so much of what we require as a teacher is simply a preference. And so often, teachers may think, well, I've done it this way for 25 years. It's worked for 25 years, and there's no need to change it now. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But sometimes there might just be a better way. And I'm sure we all can relate to the fact that sometimes you've had to change things for whatever reason. Maybe you had a routine in your classroom, but you've moved classrooms and that routine doesn't work. That maybe traffic flow in your classroom doesn't work anymore. And you might find a better way. And so being willing to be flexible in that and willing to deviate possibly from a routine is so important. I have to be especially careful now that I am in administration, that so many of my, quote, teacher preferences don't bleed over into what I require of my teachers. If it is working for them, yes, it may not be exactly how I do it, but that doesn't make it wrong by any means. And so it is a delicate balance. And you just want to make sure that you are very flexible when it comes to dealing with students and parents.
Yeah. So as an administrator, I had the privilege of serving in a large school with many teachers. And we all know that with many people comes many personalities and many preferences. That could be a whole other podcast episode in and of itself. But those personalities and preferences, kind of like you just mentioned, like how you liked how your classroom was done, those impact every classroom every day.
Mm-hmm.
So, you could look at the decor, you could look at the type of instruction, the level of organization, and yes, even the interaction with parents and students. So, Sarah, give us your insights on the role that preferences play specifically on parent-teacher relationships. Do you think that sometimes teachers' preferences get in the way of that building of a good relationship there? What do you think? Where does that fall?
It definitely can. We can sometimes alienate parents when we are unwilling to make an exception, because we know that sometimes maybe not everything is clearly black and white. And again, we're not talking about right and wrong, but we're just talking about how I prefer to do it. And sometimes we don't even take the opportunity to hear the parents. We're just, nope, no, we're not going to do it that way. And so sometimes we need to listen. Maybe we're not going to agree with them. Maybe we're going to have to tell them that we can't make an exception. But sometimes maybe we can. And going back to that, it's my way or the highway kind of attitude. I heard a quote that said, those who live by the my way or the highway attitude often end up on the side of the road alone. And parents can often, they might shut you down completely. They may
Yeah.
stop hearing you, and you may have had a legitimate reason, but you've got to truly think and take time to consider it, and not let your preferences overshadow the decision that you make.
Yeah. So as educators, we're constantly trying to strike that balance, kind of like what you just said. But even bigger than that, how strict, how lenient, how intense, how relaxed, how professional, how friendly. And at the same time, it carries over in how we deal with parents too. How much do you say? How much do you not say? How much do you mention? How much do you just let it go? How much do you give in or hold firm? All those different things come into play. So, Sarah, what are your thoughts about how flexible we should be with parents? You hinted on it a little bit there. You mentioned flexibility as we talked kind of through that section, I guess, of this episode, but how do you balance being flexible without being a pushover with parents?
Yes, I heard a statement one time that said, stay committed to your decisions, but stay flexible in your approach. That you
Mm,
are
well said.
deciding what is truly important, but it may not look the same in every situation. So, for example, if you get that email from the parent that says, my child didn't do their homework, and before you even finish the email, you are somewhat, you may be inside or actually rolling your eyes and thinking, here's another parent making excuses for their child and not, fulfilling their responsibilities. And I may have even, I'm sure I have in the past thought, you know what? They're going to have to learn a lesson because they're going to grow up and they can't shirk their responsibilities. And you're just having a whole conversation in your head, reading this email. Do parents sometimes make excuses? 100%. Yes, they do. But we don't always know what has happened. But maybe you've not even given to consideration that maybe they've learned the night before about the death of a loved one. They could have had car trouble, on the way home from school the night before, and they sat on the side of the road or in a parking lot for hours. And so asking questions is important, but also realizing that, maybe you could tell them, you know what? It sounds like you had one of those days, and I can understand that. And really, you are just establishing that you can understand that difficult days come and letting them know, you know what? I'll give your child an extra day for that assignment. Because, Jenny, it's not always our job to teach people a lesson. I have learned that maybe sometimes it's the Lord trying to teach us a lesson in possibly being more flexible. And so that's important. And if we're always demanding that it's our way without exception, we may never allow the Lord to soften our heart and teach us a better way of doing things that we might find, you know what, Lord, you knew best. And when I relinquished my preferences, my desires, then I found a better way to do it. Or I was able to win over that parent because I kind of understood what they were dealing with, and made that exception. And that you can do that. You don't have to be deemed a pushover because they understand that's not going to happen every time. But you are willing to listen and make an exception when it's warranted.
Yeah, that goes a long way with parents for sure. So you mentioned, last of all, in I guess when we were talking about our crucial components and building positive relationships, you talked about humility. So, of course, humility is a wonderful trait, but talk with us about why you chose to bring that into this discussion with parents. So, just a minute ago, you hinted at it a little bit, like we don't always have to be right. We don't always have to, stick to it. We can use those judgment calls and I guess build a huge bridge with parents as we're willing to give on those things. And sometimes that means that we aren't always right or we change what we do. So I'm guessing humility has something to do with that. What do you think?
It absolutely does. None of us like to be wrong. We don't, but we are human. And it does take a lesson in humility to admit that to parents and to students. But nothing can undo the difference you've made in the lives of students and parents more quickly than not being willing to admit where you've made a misstep. It could be something pretty big where maybe administration has to get involved. It could be something small, like you are certain that you wrote that assignment on the board, the child says you didn't, that they didn't know, and it could be, again, something small or big. Sometimes we jump the gun in scolding a student for something that maybe they weren't guilty of. Maybe we reacted before we had the facts. We've all done that. And something that truly has made that be important in my mind is just something that I remember from when actually I was a student. And there was one day that we were about to change classes, and a teacher heard a student talking, and she called me down. She thought it was me. It wasn't. And if I remember correctly, I respectfully told her that it wasn't me. And she was unwilling to back down. And even another student went up to her after class, and he said she didn't, but she would not back down. And so it was one of those, again, that was a long time ago, but I still remember how
it made an impact.
It did. And I would not have thought, I promise you, I wouldn't have thought less of her had she said, okay, well, I'm sorry, I thought that was you, but apparently it wasn't. I would have thought more of her and respected her.
It's the opposite of what we think will happen.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And if you've ever had to apologize to a class, to a student, yes, to a parent, you can truly vouch for how forgiving that they can be.
Yeah.
That will often, if you have a parent that's they're coming at you because they're upset about something maybe that you did, just as the Bible says, a soft answer turneth away wrath. And if you will admit, saying the words, I'm sorry, saying the words, I was wrong, you are right, that can often bring that tone down for them, because they're probably not expecting a teacher or any adult for that matter to own up to what they did. So if we're trying to instill in our students the importance of what the Bible says about confessing our sin, admitting our faults, and we teach them that, but how much louder are we teaching them not to do that if we won't own our mistakes? So it does take humility. Sometimes it may be a tear in the eye because you realize that oftentimes for teachers, it can be an overreaction. It could be an attitude, fussing at the class for something, and then just realizing maybe you were right in that they needed correction, but it was your response. And we are constantly teaching our students more so through what we do rather than what we say. And so teaching them about humility is one thing, but showing them humility is something completely different. And parents truly appreciate it. It's difficult. We want to be right, but we're not going to be right 100% of the time. And we have to humble ourselves and admit that to parents. And again, that's just another way that you can build those relationships.
Yeah, it's hard to not hold other people to standards we don't hold ourselves to,
Yes.
and sometimes that humility falls right in there. We want them to be the first to line up and said they didn't do it right, but doing is a whole other thing. So good reminder.
Yes.
Okay, so one more thing really quickly as we wrap up. You spent years as a teacher. Now you're in administration. That changes a lot when it comes to relationships with coworkers, of course. But quickly, do you feel that your relationships with parents are different now that you're in administration versus when you were in that classroom full time? What do you think?
Well, when I stepped out of the daily classroom 3 years ago, I'll admit that one of my fears was losing those relationships with parents, because I just enjoyed that aspect of teaching so much that I just thought, I'm just not going to have those daily interactions. I'm going to miss out on that. I was concerned that the majority of my communication as principal was going to be about discipline. And quite a bit of it is. We know that goes when you're dealing with, the entire elementary discipline problems versus one class, that a lot of that communication is about discipline and that we need your help and, what has happened. But the solution is the same: to build those positive relationships. As principal of our elementary, I have to be a good communicator. It may be about more school-wide events, but I need to make sure that they are aware of things that are coming up. I still get out in the hallways, greet parents in the morning, talk to them, talk to the students. I call the students by name. And that's what I try to do. It's always tricky at the beginning of the year when I've done all of these interviews for incoming students for the fall. And sometimes it's way back. It could be February. And then they show up in August and I'm thinking, I'm never going to remember all their names. But I'm intentional about trying to remember their names. And I did at our meet and greet, our orientation this year, I called one of the students by names. And she looked at her dad and she said, how did she remember my name? But that is important, remembering somebody's name.
Yeah, makes an impact.
So if we will be intentional about that, that right there spoke a lot to the parents. I try to recognize their birthdays, or I've done that in different ways. My first year as principal, I was overly ambitious. And what I was going to do, I was going to have lunch with every student in the elementary. And I didn't do that one-on-one. I did it in small groups of about 4 or 5, and I kept track, and I would check them off when I had had lunch. And that was a great way to build. The second year, I was a little more realistic about time management. That just took up a lot of time. And so I did the birthdays where all the students in the elementary that had birthdays that month, I would have lunch with them. That was the easier way. But just taking time to do that. The students love it. I remember them saying, Miss Barker, I thought that principals were supposed to be mean. And I said, oh, no. I said, I said, principals can be firm, if we have to correct you. But principals are our pals. And so that was important to be able to just recognize them for those things, celebrating accomplishments with them, taking pictures with the students. I'm a big picture taker. I love doing that. And so taking pictures with them at big moments, maybe it's we have our Little Eagles sports teams, maybe it's, at one of the games, taking pictures with them, that's important. With discipline, knowing when to administer discipline and consequences, and knowing when to have mercy, knowing when it could be, let's have a conversation. Let's, make this a teaching moment. That is something that, yes, I used in the classroom, but, as, having to speak to students of all ages in elementary, now I'm able to use all of those things, those same, the communication, the attention, the flexibility, the humility even, all of those look the same as principal versus how they did in the classroom. The relationships didn't change, but I just now have the opportunity to reach more. And something that I remember is that quote that I know we have all heard, that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And that is just so important for all of these areas. And I'm sure there's so many more, but I have found that these are true building blocks for establishing those relationships so that when bumps do come in the road, and they will.
And they will.
Yes, that you have truly established those relationships so they know that you care. And that's so very important as teacher, as principal, and every position in between.
That is so true. These are down in the weeds topics, but this is where we are every day as educators. Working with people can be hard. And, if we're honest, working with ourselves is hard for other people, I'm sure at times too. We are all humans, but God has put us right where we are to serve with and to partner with our coworkers, as well as the students, and of course their parents. Sarah, thank you so much. You really took us back to the basics today, helped us refocus on our true ministry with these parents and how to lead that relationship in a way that's positive, building that with them. We need to be reminded of this constantly, and I really appreciate you doing that today. This was an excellent episode, and I appreciate all you brought to the table.
Yes, you are so very welcome. It is something that we do on a daily basis. You're going to deal with parents every day. And so that I'm glad it was helpful. I enjoyed our discussion.
Absolutely. Listeners, thank you for joining us today as well. I hope you were challenged and encouraged to get in there and work at those relationships. Remember to go to teachereditionpodcast.com to submit questions for our upcoming episodes. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Now, it's time to get back to your day, but it's not just any day. Every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power and through His grace working in you. Go do what God has called you to do.